Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Bergerson, and I am the Patient Education Program Senior Coordinator for the Colon Cancer Alliance. And on behalf of my fellow patient navigators on the incredible patient support team from the Colon Cancer Alliance, I would like to welcome you to the Don't Be a Couch Potato, Physical Activity, Sedentary Behavior, and Your Colon webinar. This is the fifth segment in the Colon Cancer Alliance's Conversations about Colon Cancer webinar series, which we created to provide the opportunity for patients, survivors, and caregivers, family members, friends, and healthcare professionals to link with national experts in colorectal cancer and other related fields in an interactive online setting. As a reminder, Conversations about Colon Cancer webinar series will occur every third Wednesday of the month from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This evening's webinar will be providing some excellent information on the link between physical activity and colon cancer. We all know that timely screening is the #1 way to reduce your risk for colon cancer, but did you know there's a number of things we can do right at home? It's never too early to start making small changes in your daily life that can add up in big ways. In this webinar, our presenter will explore the relationship between the level of physical activity and your colon, including how exercise is linked to prevention and recurrence, as well as the effect of sedentary behavior. Before I introduce our speaker, just a quick note here about questions. We envision this webinar to be interactive, where attendees can pose questions for the presenters. After our speaker has finished presenting, we may be able to address a few of the questions presented by attendees during the webinar. Because of the number of attendees and because we are tracking the questions, we're only accepting questions posted online using the webinar control panel. To submit a question for consideration, click on the small plus sign located next to the word questions on the webinar control panel located on the right side of your screens at home. Then type your question in and then hit enter. All questions will be asked on a time available basis, so please accept my apologies in advance if your particular question does not get asked. However, all questions that we are unable to get to will be collected and followed up on after the webinar. And with that, we'll introduce our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Momenti this evening. Dr. Momenti is a cancer epidemiologist and postdoctoral research scientist in the National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute R25T Cancer Epidemiology Training Program at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University Medical Center, New York Presbyterian Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dr. Momenti specializes in epidemiology and prevention of colorectal neoplasia and has major risk factors including diet, sedentary behavior, and obesity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Momenti. Dr. Momenti, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I look forward to providing and sharing some information with you, some of it new, some of it emerging, and I look forward to your questions. So I have a brief outline. I'm going to start with providing background information on physical activity, sedentary behavior, and how those all link to colon cancer. And then I'm going to speak specifically about a study that I recently published and co-led with other investigators this past year on the link between sedentary behavior and the well-established precursor to colorectal cancer, which are colorectal adenomas. And we were specifically looking at adenoma recurrence. And then I'll end with some of the future endeavors and questions and some tips and application of this material that you can take home with you.
All right. Hey, Dr. Momenti, you're going to, I turned the screen over to you. You're going to have to accept the control on your side real quick.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Okay, great. All right, so here is my outline, and so we'll just follow suit as we go through here. So first, just very brief background. colorectal cancer is the third most commonly diagnosed cancer and the third leading cause of cancer-related death in both men and women, which is quite staggering. It's third after breast and lung in women and prostate in lung in men. So this translates to approximately 136,000 people who will be diagnosed with colorectal cancer and about 50,000 who will die from colorectal cancer. These are statistics from 2014. We know that the incidence and death rates for colorectal cancer increase with age, and the majority of cases do occur in people over 50. However, over the past decade, we have seen rates increasing in adults under the age of 50. So this is on the rise and an area of potential concern, which is being addressed in many different areas and different researchers today. The lifetime risk of colorectal cancer is about 5%, and that's about 1 in 20 people who will be diagnosed in their lifetime. There are there's over 1 million colorectal cancer survivors in the U.S. today, and a lot more people are living longer, mainly due to treatment and early detection. So colorectal cancer, though, is one of the most preventable cancers, and colorectal cancer can be prevented by doing very small things every day that add up to big benefits. And so when we think about colorectal cancer and its potential for prevention, we know that 50% of all cases of colorectal cancer can be prevented by healthy lifestyle habits alone. So we know that there are a number of different factors that go into a healthy lifestyle, and these include eating a variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, drinking alcohol in moderation, avoiding smoking, exercising on most days of the week, which we're going to talk about, maintaining a healthy body weight, and cutting back on red meat and avoiding processed meats. And so what this really looks like when we look at this figure here is that each of these lifestyle factors there's a lot of evidence generated on each of them. Some have provided more convincing evidence, and some more research is still needed, and there's probable evidence of that particular risk factor. So among these factors, we can see that there's convincing evidence that physical activity protects against colorectal cancer. Among these convincing evidence factors, another one is excess body fat. And because of the inextricable link between our activity level and our body weight, it takes a lot to sort of tease these two factors out in research studies. This data that I'm showing here is generated by the American Institute for Cancer Research, which systematically analyzes the totality of colorectal cancer evidence. And the report, this is a continuous update report that's based on their expert report, is the most comprehensive and authoritative reports published in this area that examines the link between colorectal cancer, food, physical activity, and weight. So it takes into account thousands of studies that have been conducted in these areas and comes up with a verdict for each one. So one of the key recommendations when we talk about physical activity, you may say, how much physical activity is needed for prevention? The American Institute for Cancer Research recommends being physically active for at least 30 minutes every single day. The intensity of that exercise should be in the moderate to vigorous intensity range. And the World Health Organization refers to intensity as the effort that's required to perform an activity or exercise, or how hard a person works to do that activity. So you want to be in a range where you're at least breathing heavily and feeling like your heart rate is elevated. The other recommendation is to limit sedentary behavior, so limit prolonged periods of sitting. You can take a quiz online with the following link that's posted here to see if you're active enough, and this will help to gauge if you're getting 30 minutes of activity every day, and there may be activities you don't even realize that qualify. So when we talk about the intensity of physical activity, it really can depend on an individual's previous exercise experience, their relative level of physical fitness, And this just provides a guide of what an approximate moderate to intensity physical activity exercise would look like, and then what a vigorous intensity physical activity would look like. And so you can see the moderate intensity requires just a moderate amount of effort, and it noticeably accelerates the heart rate, whereas the vigorous to intensity physical activity requires a large amount of effort and causes rapid breathing and a substantial increase in heart rate. So when you look at all these different activities, looking on the left and looking on the right, you should really think about what activities you can do on a daily basis. If you're doing some of these already, you should ask yourself if you're doing at least 30 minutes every day. The American Cancer Society recommends that adults should engage in at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity each week, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity each week, or some equivalent of that combination. So if you can think about doing more than your current activity, or just starting any of these activity, it's better than doing nothing. So whatever you can do in these two categories is really going to benefit, and you'll see why as we continue the presentation. So the association between physical activity and the risk of colon cancer is actually well established. The majority of studies have found that the most physically active individuals have a statistically significantly lower risk of colon cancer compared to those who are least active. And the study that I'm looking at here is actually from a meta-analysis conducted recently, which showed a 24% reduced risk for both males and females of those who exercise the most versus those who exercise the least. And this study took into account occupational, recreational, household, and transport-related activities, things like driving in our cars and commuting, which all contribute to sedentary behavior. Other systematic reviews that have been conducted recently as well that have investigated whether this varies by subsite, so whether this varies by the distal colon, the proximal colon, or the right and left side colon. And the systematic review found that the risk, about a 25% reduction, was seen in both sides. So it's not subsite specific, and we do see this throughout the colon. So we know that overall physical activity and colon cancer are inversely related, and there's a lot of evidence to show this. However, part of the problem is that physical activity is declining in the United States. And instead what we're seeing is the majority of our waking hours spent in sitting behaviors. So we know that sitting is increasingly prevalent and pervasive in our society today. And our society is sort of set up for us to be sitting-centric, for us to sit more easily in our workplaces, in our homes, common methods of transportation, like I mentioned, commuting, in our car or in public transportation, and then recreational venues that really promote sitting. And so this study, which is actually an Australian study, is showing that sedentary behavior is accounting for about a little over 9 hours per day. And the light intensity physical activity is somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 hours. Now the moderate to vigorous physical activity is still fairly fair at about 0.7 hours per day, which would account for that 30 minutes. But really, is this enough? And how is this affecting, and does this buffer or negate the effect of sitting for prolonged periods? When we look at a study conducted here in the United States, the authors in this particular evaluation assessed participants from the 2003 to 2004 National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or the NHANES study. And included in the study were all individuals 6 years or older who wore an activity monitor for up to 7 days. So in this study, there were about 6,300 participants, and the average wearing time of these monitors was about 14 hours per day. So overall, the study found that participants spent about 55% of their time in sedentary behaviors. And when you look specifically at this graph, on the left-hand side, you can see the mean hours per day from 0 to 10. The bottom, or the x-axis, is age in years. And then also you can see that the number of hours are listed along the bottom as well. Or I'm sorry, the ages are listed along the bottom on the x-axis. and above the bar you can see the number of hours, mean hours per day, that that particular age group spent in sedentary behaviors. And so you can see here that among the adults between 60 and 69 years old and the adolescents between 16 and 19 were the two groups with the highest hours of sedentary time per day. This accounts for about 60% of their waking time in sedentary endeavors. So this isn't too far off from the Australian study. This study also found that Mexican-American adults were significantly less sedentary than other U.S. adults, and white and black females were similarly sedentary after 12 years of age. So this study, when it was conducted earlier on, about 10 years ago, did provide the first objective measure of the amount of time spent in sedentary behavior in the United States. And since then, now further studies are using objective measurements to try and quantify how much time people are spent sitting during the day. Some studies have gone as far to say that sitting is a new health risk and something that we should look at as a potential risk factor for several diseases. So we know that sedentary behavior, really very simply put, are prolonged periods of sitting. There's well-established links with sedentary behavior to numerous chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of 5 different risk factors, and if a person has at least 3 of those risk factors, they are diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And those risk factors have everything to do with visceral adiposity, blood pressure, fasting blood glucose, fasting triglyceride levels, and waist circumference. And so we know that sedentary behavior is highly deleterious as a practice, a regular practice. But when we think about the most prevalent sedentary behaviors, what comes to mind? Well, in most cases, these are things like TV viewing, any kind of game use, or using the computer for extended periods of time while sitting, reading, writing, laying down, resting, spending enormous amounts of time in a car on transportation. So there are a lot of sedentary behaviors. However, the #1 most prevalent sedentary behavior in the United States is television viewing time. And in fact, previous studies used to use television viewing time as a proxy for measuring sedentary time before it was objectively measured. So when we talk about sedentary behavior, what exactly is it? So sedentary behavior, like I said, is very simply the prolonged period of sittings or reclining in the absence of whole body movement. So these are activities that require very low energy expenditure. And I'm going to talk more about this later, but this equivalent is equivalent to less than or equal to 1.5 metabolic equivalents. It is not synonymous with inactivity or the absence of physical activity. So some people will say, well, I'm not sedentary, I work out every day, or I exercise every day. But what they're not taking into account is, yes, they may meet the 30 minutes or the 150 minutes of exercise per week, but they're spending an enormous amount of their time sitting at a desk. So there are some studies that have been recently emerging, and more over the past few years than ever. And a couple of them in this recent year have been published. One is a meta-analysis, which is a statistical approach to combining data that's been derived from a literature review. And in this meta-analysis, they found over 63 reports and almost 500,000 participants that there was a 30% increased risk of colon cancer around those who were sedentary. And then another study looking specifically at visceral adiposity. And when we talk about visceral adiposity, it's very different from body mass index, which takes into account your height and weight for that calculation. Visceral adiposity is really adipose tissue or fat tissue that's concentrated around the central part of the abdomen. And it's different from subcutaneous fat because it actually embeds itself sort of within the organs and protecting the organs in our abdomen. And so this is emerging and has been well studied in previous years as one of the underlying mediators in the relationship between visceral adiposity, body fat, and disease, and specifically colorectal cancer. So there are a number of mechanisms as to why sedentary behavior is associated with colorectal cancer and what some of the biological pathways may be. People don't often think of sedentary behavior as a risk factor for disease, but there are numerous metabolic events that are dysregulated as a result of sedentary behavior. And many of these may be related to adiposity, which you can see here is one of the key links. At the bottom here is a key that we have the established association, which is these dark colored arrows, the likely association, which are not as heavy, and the possible associations, which are dashed. So it's hypothesized that the deleterious effects of sedentary behavior are mediated through this adiposity, particularly visceral adiposity, but also associated with overall body weight. And through each of these different channels, you can see, and one of the factors that is most interesting is inflammation, which has a lot of evidence to show its association with body fat and adiposity, and how that can progress to cancer and cancer progression. We know that adipose tissue or fat tissue is very, very metabolically active. It emits different growth hormones and inflammatory cytokines, and these are some of the cytokines. IL-6, interleukin-6 is one of them. But then other factors like tumor necrosis factor alpha and C-reactive protein. These are highly active compounds found in, or mediators found in adipose tissue, which can drive this progression to colorectal cancer. So it's proposed that the risk associated with sedentary lifestyle could be explained through any of these different pathways, which may stimulate the growth of colonic cancer cells. And so the sedentary behavior and the resulting reduced overall energy expenditure is associated with weight gain, and it's associated with all these processes. So you can actually use tools if you'd like to measure your BMI or specifically look at your waist circumference. Waist circumference sort of emerging as a potential proxy for visceral adiposity or central adiposity. And there's ways that you can measure these online. And this is from the American Institute for Cancer Research website. It's www.aicr.org, and the link is actually right here. But you can measure your body mass index by putting in your height and weight. And you can also learn how to measure your waist circumference accurately. So all these directions are online. What's interesting about sedentary behavior is that it may coexist with high levels of physical activity. So just as I was mentioning, some people will say, well, they are active because they work out every day. But the truth is there's people that are mostly sedentary, yet they're achieving the recommended guidelines for moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this would be an example. An active individual might engage in 30 minutes of brisk walking or jogging each day. They may ride their bike to work, and they meet the current public health recommendations on physical activity. But this leaves another 15 or so waking hours within their day that may be allocated to sitting versus standing, or spending the majority of that time sitting. And so we know that in research, and there's been several studies conducted, I'm just showing two here, that there is an independent risk of colorectal cancer from sitting too much, independent of meeting the physical activity guidelines. So these are two studies that I wanted to highlight. The first one is a prospective study which looks at the effects of sedentary behavior on colorectal cancer. And this is an interesting study. It was conducted by the National Institutes of Health AARP Diet and Health Study. So in a prospective study, it follows a similar group of individuals over a period of time. And some of the strengths of this type of study is that it provides a large cohort, a large sample size. None of the participants have developed the outcome of interest at the time that they start the study. And it really helps to look at a number of different risk factors. And so in this study, they were aiming to investigate physical activity at varying intensities and sedentary behavior in relation to colorectal cancer. So this study looked at almost 500,000 participants that participated in the AARP study. And they followed these participants for about 50 years, about 8 years, and they were anywhere from 50 to 71 years of age. So they mailed them a baseline questionnaire that requested information on diet, family history of cancer, physical activity, and other factors. And these participants self-reported how much time they spent in different behaviors. And so what they found is that there was a 61% increase in colon cancer of men who reported higher daily sedentary activity. So those who sat for more than 9 hours per day had a 61% increase in colorectal cancer, which is an astonishing amount and a very high percentage of those that would go on to develop cancer. Now in the second study, this was a control study where they took, so patients or participants at the start of the study had the outcome of interest, they had colon cancer, and they looked back and measured their activities over the course of their lifetime in terms of occupation. And in this particular study, they found a twofold increase, or a 50% more than additional found relationship requirements of daily physical activity. So we know that it's not only important to increase our physical activity or aim to meet the guidelines, but also to reduce our amount of sitting. So the couch potato paradigm has actually been published. I didn't come up with it, but other researchers have characterized this type of person who is active and gets their exercise in but sits all day as the active couch potato. So these are people who engage in regular, vigorous activity, but also engage in prolonged periods of sitting. So the bottom line here is that achieving recommended levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity may not fully protect against high amounts of sedentary behavior. So you really need to consider both when you're thinking about colorectal cancer prevention. This was also studied in all-cause mortality. So all-cause mortality is really death from any cause, not just cancer, but diabetes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and other chronic conditions. And so time spent in sedentary behaviors are not only associated with colorectal cancer, but all-cause mortality in general. And in this particular study, the aim was to test the hypothesis that higher amounts of overall sitting time and television viewing are positively associated with mortality. And so again, this study was conducted using the NIH AARP study, the Diet and Health Study. And in this study, they looked at about 250,000 adults, 240,819, again 50 to 71 years of age, who did not report any cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, or any outcome at baseline. And then they evaluated sedentary behaviors in the form of television viewing time. And what they found here was that there was a positive association among those who watched TV for more than 7 hours per day, and a positive association with colorectal cancer. And this was true even if they reported more than 7 hours a week, or about 1 hour per day, of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we know that this also has a great effect on all-cause mortality. Now, colorectal cancer is a multi-stage process, and it's a very slow-growing tumor. So we know it can take decades to develop. So from the time that you have this is the lining of your colon, but from the time that you have no essential sign of any neoplastic lesion or any kind of development, to the time you go all the way to an adenoma, this can be a decade or 2 decades, 3 decades. So it's very slow growing. And along each of these steps, there's different changes that occur that start from a very small DNA alteration that eventually proliferates and undergoes numerous genetic alterations that lead to what we know as a benign polyp or adenoma that's discovered in the colon. And so we know that what drives this process, or one of the key drivers of this process, is inflammation. And this is a multi-step process that has been well documented. And one of the key components that I want to discuss is that the adenoma is really the perfect point of prevention, because at this point we have the chance to remove the adenoma. If it's small enough, there are chances that it can regress through different lifestyle habits and different agents that actually reduce inflammation, things like aspirin. And we know that this is a prime area to sort of target to prevent the progression to full-blown colorectal cancer. So recently, our team conducted a study, and we looked specifically at sedentary behavior associated with colorectal adenoma recurrence. So we know that 95% of colorectal adenoma and adenoma carcinomas arise from the adenomatous polyp, and we know that about 30 to 40% of the population will develop an adenoma by the time they're 60 years old. And of those who have an adenoma removed, 20 to 50% of those patients will be found to have a recurrent adenoma when they undergo a routine colonoscopy in the next 3 to 5 years. So there are a number of factors that have been well studied that are associated with adenoma progression and adenoma recurrence. And a couple of the things that we can't change are the size of the adenoma that was removed, the number of adenomas that were removed, what location they're in the colon, whether they're further down on the left side in the distal colon or further up on the right side in the proximal colon, and then the histology of that particular polyp. There's many different types of polyps and different histological subtypes, and it's the ones with villus or tubulovillus histology that create the biggest problem and have the biggest chance of recurrence. So polyps are categorized into advanced and non-advanced, and these factors can all contribute whether an adenoma recurs. There are also numerous lifestyle factors that have been associated with colorectal adenoma recurrence, and those have to do with body weight, vitamin D, different factors in our diet like fiber. And so we want to, in this study, look specifically at the effect of sedentary behavior on the odds of adenoma recurrence, and if these prolonged periods of sitting really have an effect. And so the study was conducted by pooling 2 large phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled double-blind clinical trials together. There were about 1,730 participants in the study, and we hypothesized that higher sedentary behavior would be associated with increased odds of colorectal adenoma recurrence. And adenoma recurrence was defined as any adenoma identified upon colonoscopy at least 6 months post-randomization. So the sample that we had was, as I mentioned, 1,700 adults, and they were predominantly older adults with the average age at 65.9. The majority were male, majority were white, and the mean BMI is considered overweight. A BMI of anywhere from 25 to 30 is considered overweight. 30 and above is considered obese, and anywhere from 18 to 25 is considered normal. So baseline, the participants were asked to fill out a questionnaire to get a sense for how active they were and how much time they spent in sedentary behavior as well as other activities. And so actually this questionnaire really honed in on recreational, leisure, household, and other activities. And so they were asked, did you do this activity in the last 4 weeks? How many times did you do this activity, and how much time did you spend on this activity? And so when I was starting this analysis with our team, we initially were focused on physical activity because we knew of the established association. But in this study, we didn't actually find an association between recreational physical activity and colorectal cancer, but instead, when we went back into the literature, we realized that what we were finding from our data was that people that were involved in these sedentary behaviors, or what we call leisure activities, were at the greatest risk. So we categorized our data based upon the Sedentary Behavior Research Network guidelines. And so of all these activities that people participated in, we categorized them by their metabolic equivalents. So we didn't just ballpark whether someone went to a movie or someone went to another social event or someone was traveling in the car or going to medical appointments as sedentary. We actually went to the compendium of physical activity and looked at the exact MET values of each of these activities and then grouped them into various criteria that was set up by the Sedentary Behavior Research Network guidelines. So those who were sedentary, anyone involved in activities that were less than 1.5 METs, which is very close to resting, were considered sedentary. All activities between 1.5 and 3 were considered light intensity physical activity. And then any activities that were more than 3 METs were considered moderate to vigorous physical activity. So you may ask, what are metabolic equivalents? So these are standard ways to estimate calories burned, and basically it uses your weight and it looks at the amount of oxygen consumed for a particular activity. So it relates to the oxygen requirements needed to perform that task. So there's a table of standard MET equivalent values for exercise and different activities that's been published, and so that's what we use. So if you can see here, these very low metabolic equivalents, less than 1, here we have our couch potato, and then as you move into these light intensity activities, the MET values increase, and they increase from moderate to vigorous and vigorous. So when I showed you those lists of all those different activities, those were in this moderate to vigorous and vigorous intensity activities. So in this study we found that among those who were sedentary for more than 9 hours per day, and here we have our odds ratio, had the greatest odds of adenoma recurrence. So let me orient you to this particular figure. Here on the side we have our adjusted odds ratio, and the odds ratio is just a measure of the association between an exposure and an outcome. And so our exposure is behavior and our outcome is adenoma recurrence. So it represents the odds that the adenoma recurrence will occur given the level of sedentary behavior that we were measuring. And so here we see our number of participants in each of these different quartiles. So of all the people that engaged in sedentary behavior, we divided them into 4 different quartiles. And each of these quartiles, these are all under 9 hours per day of sedentary behavior, and these are over 9 hours per day of sedentary behavior. So we saw a 47% increase in colorectal adenoma recurrence among those who sat for more than 9 hours per day. And this was a significant trend. So even as you went into the 4th quartile, which is the highest level, so this was above 11 hours per day of sedentary behavior, we saw this trend persist. And so our overall conclusion is that there was a statistically significant 47% increase for behavior compared to those who spend less than 4 hours per day, which was our reference group. So this is an evolving field. Our understanding of the potential adverse effects of time spent in sedentary behavior is evolving rapidly. If you look at the amount of research that's been conducted even in the last 3 to 5 years on sedentary behavior, it has been rapidly increasing compared to what was done several decades ago. However, there are still a lot of unanswered questions, and one of those is the amount of moderate to vigorous activity that may be required to mitigate the adverse effects of sedentary time. So for our active couch potato, for example, who is working out, who is meeting the guidelines, how much do they have to work out and at what intensity do they need to do if they're the type of person that sits at the office all day? Now we also know that there's emerging evidence showing the effects of what we call interrupting our prolonged periods of sitting with these bouts of exercise. So we're trying to break up prolonged periods of sitting, which may have beneficial effects on chronic disease and cancer in general. So this is the other part of sedentary behavior that needs to really be looked at. If someone is sitting for 7 to 8 to 9 hours per day, how often and at what intervals and for what length of time do they need to spend doing some activity to break up those prolonged periods of sitting? So now I just want to summarize, and then we'll go on to questions. Sedentary behavior is highly prevalent in the United States, and it continues to increase. Prolonged periods of sitting are associated with increased risk for cancer, including not only colorectal cancer, but all-cause mortality or death from any cause. We have to remember that sedentary behavior is distinctly different from inactive, and reducing the amount of time spent sitting is essential for optimal health and disease prevention. So some of the future endeavors that we need to look at are expanding our approach to designing and novel ways to influencing sedentary behavior in addition to increasing physical activity. One of the things that's very interesting about sedentary behavior is, unlike getting people to exercise more, you don't have to ask them to sign up for an expensive gym membership or go to purchase expensive exercise equipment. Sedentary behavior might be able to be eliminated or mitigated through micro-interventions, very small things, and we're going to talk about some of these at the very end. But there are also differences between men versus women in what they're able to do, types of activity that may differ, and types of activity that
Dr. Momente, we appear to have lost your sound here.
jawbone and other things where, yes?
Yeah, your sound was cutting in and out a little bit there.
Okay. So I just want to leave you with some strategies to move more and to sit less. So one of the things you really have to do is schedule it. You have to put it in your planner, make it a priority for each day, and however you need to do that, you don't want to leave it up to chance. Either it's writing yourself a note, it's setting an alarm, it's choosing a specific time every day so it becomes routine. It's really important to schedule it. The second thing is to set a goal. What do you hope to accomplish that day? How many times do you want to get up if you're sitting most of the day? Bring a friend or have some support system that will help you get to your goal. And then keep a log every day, a sedentary behavior log, to see how much you're actually sitting. And finally, ask yourself each day, what is my goal? What can I do this month, this week, or right now to change and move toward my goal? So here I'm going to just end with a list of things you can do. 1, stand instead of sit. If you're on the phone, why not have the conversation standing? If you're at work, if you're watching TV, why don't you get up during the commercials? Think about moving more while you're watching TV or in meetings. Set a timer every day so you remember and remind yourself to stand instead of sit, or get up and move around. Track your steps with any of the common pedometers or fitness tracking devices that are out there, and try to aim for 10,000 steps per day. Also, take a break and walk up and down the stairs, or take the stairs instead of the elevator. Do whatever you can to keep movement, not only to increase physical activity, but to decrease sitting time. Walk around the block. Use a standing desk when possible. And then take your book on a walk. If you're a person that likes to read and spends a lot of time sitting reading, you can use different devices like Audible or other Audible devices that you can listen to while you're walking, and you can listen to your book. Maybe you split time between listening and reading. So I hope these have provided some ways that you can apply some of the work that I presented. And I really just want to leave you with the fact that this is within your control. We can all make decisions to engage in very small steps every day that will make a big difference overall in our health, and especially for our prevention of colorectal cancer. So I want to leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Momente. We do have a few questions that have come in, and as a reminder, go ahead and submit those questions using the question function on your screen. Our first question, it comes to us from Robert, and Robert would like to know, is sleep included in the definition of sedentary behavior?
That's an excellent question. In our studies, we adjusted the daily activity so that it was adjusted to a 24-hour period to include sleep. So sleep per se isn't concluded typically as a sedentary behavior. It's typically our waking hours that are accounted for in these studies. So sleep is a whole other issue that actually requires a lot of research and is emerging as a research area, but typically for the calculation of sedentary time, it is not included as part of the risk that's associated with it, with disease, with chronic disease.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Sherry, who would like to know what studies are being done specifically for women.
That's another great question. I am trying to think if anything has been done with the Women's Health Initiative, WHI, which I haven't seen yet. The Iowa Women's Cohort is another large cohort. If you wouldn't mind, and my understanding is that these questions will be on record and I can provide an answer to the question after the conversation is concluded, and I can respond to you in a personal email with any information on that. I'd be happy to help in any way there.
Perfect. We'll make that happen for you.
Okay.
Next question I have is Sherry has another question here. Do you foresee the screening age for insurance company purposes being lowered anytime soon? There are more and more folks under the typical screening age of 50, and I'm guessing that this question is going to be relative to sedentary behavior within those age screening guidelines.
That's another excellent question. This is very interesting. I don't know if that's going to be a big policy issue and something that's going to take a lot of effort to try and change the screening age. But with this increasing and very concerning increase in those under 50, there are a number of risk factors. When we look at the risk factors for colorectal cancer, and we know several of them, they're for everything from having a hereditary, a family member, a first-degree family member with colorectal cancer or polyps, a personal history of colorectal cancer or polyps, any inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, which include Crohn's, and inflammatory bowel disease. And we also know that obesity, sedentary behavior, diet, etc., which I have mentioned, are also risk factors. And it's interesting because when only 30% of them have identifiable risk factors and 70% don't have any identifiable risk factors, and a lot of people are asymptomatic. So I think it's going to take a large effort to try and increase education about some of these lifestyle factors and things related to anthropometrics, or what I'm describing as body weight, body mass index, and some of these lifestyle behaviors to really identify people who are at risk. And although that is not one of the current recommendations, and maybe that will change over time, but at this point I don't see that happening in the near future, but maybe that is something that will progress over time. But that's an excellent question.
All right, thank you, Doctor. We have a question from Amy. Amy is a 39-year-old female with stage 3C colon cancer, and was told that if her body wants to rest, as that is the best healing process for her. Surgery took so much from her, and she wanted to know, is this presentation geared for people not to get colon cancer, or for people who have already had it or have it?
The premise of this presentation is really based on primary and secondary prevention, really trying to prevent cancer, colorectal cancer. But I want to, and this will be something I'd like to follow up with Amy after the call, because there is a lot of research, and one of the key researchers in this area is Jeffrey Meyerhart at Harvard, and he has spent a lot of time and has published quite extensively on the effects of exercise post-colorectal cancer diagnosis. And a lot of what he is showing is that it is beneficial if you're able to engage in some form of physical activity. And again, this is something I can address after the call, and I'd be happy to forward or at least lead you in the right direction of looking at some of his work in this area, because I think it's pretty significant, and it's very compelling research to show that whatever you can do to increase some form of physical activity can really impact prognosis and survival and a number of other factors.
Very good. The next question comes to us from Ryan. And Ryan asked, you mentioned that the research isn't complete, but if I have a job that requires sitting, how often do you recommend that I get up and walk around? And how long should I do that? 10 minutes, 5 minutes, etc.?
This is a great question, and there are some studies that are looking at breaking up prolonged periods of sitting. Some of them have looked at breaking up sitting with 2-minute bouts of light intensity physical activity by, walking at a very slow pace every 20 minutes. Some are showing 2-minute bouts of moderate intensity physical activity every 20 minutes. We don't really have a defined, we can't give a recommendation on this, but I would just suggest a couple things. One is if you're able to stand at any point in your office during the day, whatever you're able to accommodate would be, number one, very helpful. Say you commit to any time the phone rings, you stand up to take that call, or you walk in place to take that call. Secondly, if you can take at least, maybe it's once every hour, and again, we don't have data on this, but doing as much as you can to break up those prolonged periods of sitting. And if you've tried a Fitbit or any of these pedometers, you'll notice that just by walking in place, you're actually generating steps for the day. So whatever you can do, you may not even need to travel outside of your office by walking. You may be able just to stand or lightly jog in place every few minutes, or for a couple of minutes every hour, just to see some effect. But again, this is all speculation. We don't have really defined evidence to support this at this time.
All righty. At this time, unless there's any other additional questions that are going to come in, don't have any other questions that are coming in at the time. Is there anything that you would like to add, Doctor? We have a few minutes here.
Well, I guess I would just like to urge everyone to really think about your day. Think about tomorrow and what tomorrow looks like for you. And write down in the morning how much time you would like to engage in physical activity, and maybe put in 2 strategies for that day, or just one strategy on how you hope to decrease or reduce any prolonged periods of sitting that you see for that day. And I think that's the best thing I can leave you with, because it's these little things every day that are going to add up to bigger health results 10, 20 years from now. And that's one of the biggest problems with prevention, is that people don't see the consequence right away. But making these small steps every day can really have a large impact. And so I just really urge you to make it a priority. Know that this is within your control, that you can do something to really impact your health in the future, especially for colorectal cancer prevention, but then again, just for all chronic disease prevention. So I'd be happy to take any additional questions that people come up with after the call. I'd be happy to answer questions as needed. And thank you very much for listening and for attending.
Very good. Thanks everyone who submitted their questions, and we will be for the 2 questions that needed additional follow-up. We have your contact information, and we will get that over to Dr. Clemente, and she will follow up with you. I want to thank everyone again for your questions and for being here tonight. But we're out of time and out of questions here. But before we go, don't forget to join us for our 6th webinar in the Colon Cancer Alliance's Conversations webinar series, Dehydration, Causes and the Impact on Your Treatment and What You Can Do. And that's going to be coming up on May 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The link to that registration should be up on our website here in the next few days. And look for it there at www.ccalliance.org/webinars. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing later on within a week of this broadcast, again at ccalliance.org/webinars. And in addition, we'll be posting the top 5 webinar takeaways and other related information to our blog the week following the webinar, check out our blog at ccalliance.org/blog. In the future, the Colon Cancer Alliance will be forwarding you a very brief survey about this webinar. We truly value your opinion and would be very appreciative if you could take the time to answer a few questions when you get that survey. We're always trying to make our webinars better for our attendees. In addition, if you'd like to share any comments regarding the webinar in advance or have any ideas or thoughts or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly at kbergerson@ccalliance.org. On behalf of the Colon Cancer Alliance and tonight's presenter, I'd like to once again thank everyone for attending the webinar. I hope you found it informative and value-added. Good evening and take care, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening.